July 12th, 1892. Dear Martha, Daniel said, "What about the train? Didn't they say the train was going to go all the way to Miami?" Mr. Mickelson said, "Not yet. As far as I know, it only goes down to Daytona Beach at this point." I said, "What about a ship? We're right on the seacoast." Mr. Mickelson said, "Now that's an idea. Ships leave here daily to go down the coast." Miss Melman said, "Yes, you can leave in the morning. You can take Gabriel. Once you're there, you'll need some way to travel. A horse would be much faster than traveling on foot." I said, "Perfect. But do you think they let horses on a boat?" Mr. Mickelson said, "I don't know why not. I think they take horses and cattle. It's just a one-day sail. You don't even have to spend the night on the ship." Daniel said, "And Ethelbert?" Mrs. Melman said, "There's always the baby pram." That made us laugh. And so we agreed that in the morning, Miss Melman and Mr. Mickelson would take Daniel, me, Ethelbert, and Gabriel down to the dock to put us on a boat for Juneau before Mr. Mickelson had to leave town. Miss Melman said, "You children go to bed and get some rest. Then I'll do the dishes." Mr. Mickelson said, "I'll help. There aren't too many. Together we'll be done in no time." I lay on the guest bed and tried to sleep. I was tired, but Miss Melman and Mr. Mickelson were talking softly as they did the dishes. I didn't mean to listen, but I could hear them. Sort of, if I listened hard enough. Okay, I went to the wall and put my ear next to it, but I had to know what they were saying. Miss Melman said, "Do you think they'll be all right?" Mr. Mickelson said, "Cassie, they're smart kids. They've made it this far. Teddy is right. If she doesn't get down to that land office soon, this Jimbo Dud might just be able to steal her father's land." He called her Cassie. Miss Melman said something I couldn't hear. Then Mr. Mickelson said, "I hope so for her sake, but if they're not, then the land should belong to Teddy. Her father worked hard for that land." Miss Melman said something else I couldn't hear. Mr. Mickelson spoke to her gently. "We will do whatever we can to help them." Miss Melman said, "Thank you, John. You are so kind." He said, "Good night, dearest." He called her dearest. She said, "Good night." Then they kissed. I didn't see them kiss, but I think they kissed because there was this silent part, and I don't know what else could have been happening. They kissed. I'm sure of it. I hope they kissed. I was sure Miss Melman thinks he's the cat's pajamas. Mr. Mickelson is so handsome and smart and funny and nice, and he seems crazy about her. And he has a good job. And he kissed her. Maybe. But in the middle of the night, when I got up to use the chamber pot, I heard crying. I peeked in Miss Melman's room. Her back was to me, and she was crying into her pillow. I sat on the side of her bed and softly rubbed her back, like Mama used to do for me. I said, "Tears are good. Don't try to stop them." After a while I said, "It's the man in the gold locket, isn't it?" She nodded. I said, "You're thinking what a fine man he was." She nodded. I said, "Sometimes we just have to let go of things we love." She nodded. I said, "I think Mr. Mickelson is a fine man, too." She sat up, wiping her eyes. "You do?" I nodded, and we both smiled. She said, "Me, too." We hugged, and I tiptoed back to bed. Love, Teddy. July 13th, 1892. Dear Martha, I wish you were here. All this would be easier if you could be with me, too. Before we left, I stroked Girlie's soft brown hide. She was as sweet as ever. I pictured Mama sitting beside her on the stool milking. Oh, Mama, how I miss her. I watched Mr. Mickelson hitch Gabriel to the back of the buggy. I pictured Pap sitting on Gabriel, studying the maps and galloping up to the captain. Pap, would I see them again? The thought of it made me want to get on with my journey as soon as possible. Mr. Mickelson drove us down to the boat dock. He was gone for a while, making inquiries about where to get tickets, which ship would be leaving the dock, and so forth. He came back with tickets and drove his buggy down to the steamer Daniel and I would be sailing on, the Lady Augustine. I could get you as far as Fort Pierce. No one's going more south than that for 3 days. Lots of people, animals, and workers swirled around the dock. Men loaded and unloaded supplies. Mr. Mickelson and Daniel led Gabriel up a ramp to the lower deck to find the animal stalls. While they were gone, Miss Melman gave me instructions. Here's some extra money for travel, Teddy. Please keep it safe in your neck pouch. Don't let anyone see you take it out. There's enough for a few nights' lodging at a boarding house. When you and Daniel get to the courthouse and all is well, please telegraph me to let me know you are safe. Oh, and here's your suitcase with a change of clothing for each of you and a clean handkerchief. And here's a hamper of food. That should last you all day and even tonight. I said, thank you, Miss Melman. I'll pay you back. I really will. She said, don't be silly. You already have. Mr. Mickelson helped Daniel and me find deck chairs. They were long, so we could stretch out our legs and be comfortable. Dogs were allowed, thank goodness, so Ethelbert stretched out between us. The steam whistle blew. A man shouted, all ashore that's going ashore. We waved goodbye to Miss Melman and Mr. Mickelson from our chairs. The steamer began to chug. The water around the dock vibrated and danced. Soon the Lady Augustine was underway, moving south along the coast. The figures of Miss Melman and Mr. Mickelson grew smaller and smaller until we could no longer see them. The journey had just begun, but Daniel said, let's eat. That boy must be going through a growing spell because he could eat all day long and then ask for seconds. We brought out the hamper of food and ate our picnic from our deck chairs. We saw big birds with long yellow beaks with pouches under them. Daniel said, pelicans. One of the pelicans dived in the water and came up a moment later with a full pouch. He opened his mouth to let the water drain out. He saw the fish he had caught flipping its silvery body back and forth. But before the pelican could close his mouth again and swallow the fish, a seagull swooped in and stole the fish from his mouth. Daniel said, ha, just like Jimbo done. After lunch, we lay in the sunshine and watched the scenery go by. We played checkers and told stories and riddles. I remembered we were to dock by sundown, and I wanted to make some sketches before then. While I began to sketch a sketch of the pelican and the seagull, Daniel went off on his own to explore the steamer. It couldn't have been an hour later that he came back, out of breath and looking like he had seen a ghost. I said, what is it? What's wrong? He said, you won't believe who's on this ship. I said, who? Daniel said, Jimbo Dud. Great buckets of butter beans. It's my worst nightmare. Love, Teddy. July 14th, 1892. Dear Martha, I hated to leave you hanging, but things are so busy. I just write when I can. I couldn't believe my eyes. Jimbo Dud lay on a deck chair in a little alcove asleep. There were no other passengers around. It was a good thing, because his loud, snuffly snores could have been heard a mile away. In his one hand, he held a thin bottle of whiskey. His other hand was tucked under his head. Daniel and I tiptoed back so he wouldn't see us if he woke up. I said, that scallywag. Daniel said, what's our plan? I said, I bet he's headed right down where we're going. I bet he's got the landing with him too. Daniel said, of course he does. We're going to have to get it. I said, while he's asleep? I was filled with dread. Daniel said, the thought of facing Jimbo Dud asleep is a whole lot better than the thought of facing Jimbo Dud awake. I said, you're right about that, but we're going to be docking soon. Daniel said, have you got that extra handkerchief Miss Melman gave you? I gave it to him. He said, good. Now you stay back here and let me get that deed. That way, if he wakes up and chases us, one of us can get away and get help. I said, what are you going to do? Daniel said, I think he's had a few nips of that whiskey. Now stay here till I come back, okay? I agreed. Daniel disappeared into the alcove and I waited. I waited and waited and waited. What was he doing? What could be taking this long? I pictured Jimbo pinning Daniel down, ripping the deed out of his hands. Suddenly I noticed the sound of the steamer slowing down. We would be docking soon. I couldn't stand it any longer. I tiptoed back around to the alcove and peeked inside. What I saw almost made me jump out of my skin, right on the spot. Jimbo was laying on his side. His hands were bound together with one of his long bootlaces. Another lace bound his feet. Daniel had stuffed my handkerchief in Jimbo's mouth and had bound his faded blue bandana around Jimbo's head to hold his mouth shut. Jimbo was wide awake and madder than a hornet. I said, "How did you do all this by yourself?" My heart was thumping like Sousa's big bass drum. Daniel said, "I used my noggin, that's how." He smiled, held up the land-aid, and sang, "Ta-da!" Jimbo growled and snarled, but the bandana stayed in place. I looked at his raging face. "You can't have Pap's land." Daniel said, "Let's go. We're about to dock." The loud steam engine revved up and began chugging us in towards the dock. The whistle blew. Daniel and I ran back to our chairs, gathered up our stuff, and slipped a leash on Ethelbert's collar. The dock below us was once again swarming with people, and I didn't want Ethel to get lost in the turmoil. Daniel went down to the lower deck to lead Gabriel off. It took a while to get the boat stopped and alongside the dock, get it tied to the pilings, and to lower the gangplank and the ramps. While I was waiting, thoughts of furious Jimbo Dud getting loose filled my head. Could we get away in time? Would he continue to come after us? But there was Daniel, leading Gabriel down the ramp and onto the dock. Ethel and I gathered our bundle and joined him. While everyone else was being greeted by friends and family, while the workers were unloading trucks and suitcases, while children were laughing and crying, we slipped away quietly. Just as we got to the road, I looked back. My eyes scanned both decks. There was no sign of Jimbo. Love, Teddy.